Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. You know, the most common question I heard while leading 4 workshops this fall had to do with achieving a proper exposure in difficult lighting situations and how to properly set up bracketing in order to solve this problem. And although exposure bracketing, isn't a new technique, it's often set up incorrectly in camera. And in this video, I'm going to address this concern along with how you can avoid this common bracketing mistake in order to get the very best exposure every single time. Now, it's important to understand exactly, what's the problem that exposure bracketing solves and how does exposure bracketing work? And I'm glad you asked that question. So this is an almost completed photograph from my workshop in the Dolomites just a few weeks ago. It's not completely finished. As I'm looking at it, I kind of think the sky might be a little bit too blue, or some some dodging and burning I plan on doing in the foreground right through here, but it is almost complete, and I really like the way it's starting to come together. But this is the raw photo right here. So what is the problem that exposure bracketing solves? It is one of the most beneficial techniques, especially for outdoor photography, because it's very common for us to encounter a scenario where there is an exposure challenge that happens to be present. And this is an example right here. So this image right here, this is a 3-shot exposure bracket. So this is an HDR blend. This is a blend of 3 photographs together, because as you can see in the raw file here, there is some areas of deep shadow, and there's also an area of a very bright overexposed or almost overexposed sky. And let me come up here to the develop module. I'm going to hit the shortcut key J, which, if you're not familiar with what the shortcut key J is extremely beneficial inside of Lightroom, of course. It turns on the clipping indicator, which is basically going to tell you areas that are either underexposed or overexposed. Areas that are underexposed will be highlighted in blue. Areas that are overexposed will be highlighted in red. So as you can see right here, there is quite a few areas of underexposed shadows right through here, or clip shadows. So while I was on location, I was looking at my histogram and I could see that there's a lot of information piled up on the left side of the histogram, and there's also a lot of information piled up on the right side of the histogram. This is kind of that telltale sign that is going to tell you on location that you might need to exposure bracket this scene. When you kind of get that U shape in your histogram where there's a ton of information in the dark tones, ton of information in the brighter tones, and you're having a difficult time getting a good exposure of both. So while I was on location, I knew that all of this area was extremely dark, and more than likely these areas were going to be underexposed. And I could tell this just by looking at my histogram. And if I were to slow down my shutter speed in order to allow more light to come in order to get more light on these shadows right through here, you can see that those blue tones that were highlighted started to go away a little bit. But now you can start to see that these red tones, this red alert is coming into the sky, which is basically saying these are overexposed highlights, which is extremely bad as well. So no matter what I did on location to my camera settings, there was really nothing I could do to get this perfectly exposed in a single photograph. Let me reset this and turn off the clipping indicator. So that is a quick rundown exactly of the problem that bracketing solves. So whenever you have that high dynamic range scene, and what that means is that it's a term that's thrown around a lot, high dynamic range scene. I remember hearing it all the time and I'm like, what the heck does that even mean? What's a high dynamic range scene? And in layman's terms, to put it very, very simple, whenever you're photographing a scene that's got very dark areas, and at the same time there's also very bright areas of the scene, in landscape photography that is generally going to be your skies, the brighter area, and an area in your foreground is going to be a little bit darker. That is a very high dynamic range scene. If your sky is not very bright and your foreground, if your sky is not very bright and your foreground is kind of a similar exposure as well, that's not a very high dynamic range scene. So that's in a nutshell exactly what that means. So this was the single image for this photograph. This was my base exposure. And what bracketing does is it's going to give you the ability to take a photograph of the same exact scene, but just with a slightly different camera setting. Not with a different aperture, not with a different ISO value, but with a different shutter speed. So what I did in this scenario is I did 2 stops over and 2 stops under. I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but as I show you real quick, it'll make sense here. So this is the base exposure right through here. This next photograph is 2 stops underexposed from this right here. And then the next photograph is 2 stops overexposed from the base exposure. So once again, this photograph here is the base exposure. This is 2 stops under. This is 2 stops over that base exposure. And ultimately, this is the photograph that is going to be for the detail in the sky. This is the photograph that is going to be the detail for everything else. And then this photograph is that base exposure. And then when you have those photographs, Lightroom does this very well. It's the HDR blend. You can do it in Photoshop. There's also a ton of other HDR types of program that blends these types of photos together. It's a very simple process to do. I think I've made a couple videos on this in the past of how to do this inside of Lightroom, which I'll link above here if you want to check that out as well. But it's a very simple process. But the problem that I see often, I used to do this as well, and I'll show you real quick. So that's a quick rundown of exactly how I captured this photograph. Now, if you want to set this up, let me go back here real quick, set this up automatically. Most cameras today have an automatic exposure bracketing function. It works very, very well where you basically just tell your camera that you want to do a 3-shot exposure bracket or maybe a 5-shot exposure bracket. And then you tell your camera how many stops of light in between each photograph you want it to capture. Generally speaking, I would say most people usually will do 1 stop of light between 3 shots or maybe 2 stops of light between 3 shots. But you can set all this up automatically, and then when you just hit your shutter, it just captures all 3 of those photographs very quickly. But sometimes that can cause a problem for you. So here is an instant where I had a photograph. Well, before I show you exactly why this one is so dark, what I used to do is I would set it up automatically in camera and I would never ever change it. And now we're starting to get to that common problem to avoid, is that so many times people will set up exposure bracketing in camera and that's it. It never ever changes. They just lock it in there and every exposure bracket is the same exact way. That's not really a great route to go. Sometimes doing a manual exposure bracket is a good way to go as well, because when you do a manual exposure bracketing, that actually forces you to pay attention to the light, pay attention to the scene, and make that shutter speed adjustment. And remember, you don't want to change your aperture or your ISO when you're doing exposure bracketing. You only want to change your shutter speed for the most part. And when you do it manually, it's forcing you to look at the scene and go, well, man, I'm shooting directly in the sun. I need to do 3 stops of light between each photograph, and I need to do 5 images and not 3. Or maybe there's not a huge range of exposure a dynamic range that I need to capture. So maybe I'll just do 3 photographs, 2 stops apart. But there is benefits of doing it manually. The downside of doing it manually is it's a little bit slower. And if there's a lot of wind blowing, maybe leaves in a tree or things like that, maybe you want to try and get it done a little bit quicker. And that's where automatic exposure bracketing comes in. But here is the problem that you really want to avoid. I've done this before and I've seen a lot of people on location do it as well. But once again, this is that base exposure here. And remember, I already did this exposure bracketing on location, and I did 3 photographs, 2 stops of light apart. But if I did 3 photographs, 3 stops of light apart, that would be a total of additional dynamic range of 9 additional stops, which is huge, right? You'd think that's fantastic. But here's what happens. Here's that base exposure right here. And if I take the next photograph, 3 stops underexposed from this, look at that, almost pure black. Look at the histogram. If I hit the shortcut key J here, look at all of that. You really didn't pick up much at all. Now, if I go 3 stops of additional exposure over that base exposure, look at this. Look at that, hit the shortcut key J. You look how overexposed that is. Look at the histogram here. You really didn't need to do that. Doing 3 stops of light between each one of these is far too much. You didn't really pick up that much. So this is another good example here I'll show you in just a moment. So paying attention to what that light is, paying attention to that individual scene and not just setting it on auto and never ever changing it. I think maybe like 3 or 4 years, I set my exposure bracketing on 1 stop, and that's all that I did this entire time. And then I set it on 2, and then I started to really pay attention. So I use auto exposure bracketing all the time. I like the ease of use of it, but I change the settings constantly. Every single scene I'm photographing, I make a decision. Am I going to do a 3-shot exposure bracket or a 5-shot exposure bracket? Am I going to do 2 stops of light between each photograph, or am I going to do 2.5 stops of light, or am I going to do 3 stops of light between each photograph? But reading that scene and paying attention to that is absolutely critical. Now, this is a scenario where doing 3 photographs, I did 4 photographs here, I believe. 3 stops of light between each photograph, because this is a very high dynamic range scene. As you can see, it's in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. I am shooting directly into the sun. If I hit the shortcut key J, you can see this area in red is completely overexposed. All of this area is clipped highlights. Now the next photograph is going to be 3 stops underexposed from that. And then here is 3 more stops underexposed from that just for the sky right here. And then here is the blended HDR photograph. If I hit the shortcut key I, you can see that HDR right there. So this particular image here was absolutely critical to get those 3 additional stops. So this is the scene. This is an example where if I would have left my camera on auto exposure bracketing, and I had the standard two additional stops of exposure between all 3 of these photographs, I would not have picked up all of this dynamic range. I would have still had areas of underexposed shadows. I would have still had areas of overexposed highlights. And once again, this is the base exposure right here, 2 stops beneath that, 2 more stops beneath that. I think I did that wrong, actually. I think this is the base exposure. This is the 2 stops, or 3 stops over, and this is the 3 stops under. That's exactly how it went. But that ultimately gave me this exposure right here. So the big mistake you want to avoid, really in summary, is just setting your camera on auto exposure and however you have it set up and never ever changing it. You really want to think about whatever settings you have dialed in for your auto exposure bracketing every single time you go to use it to read that scene. And generally speaking, I think most people usually do a 3-shot exposure bracket, and it's usually somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 1.5 stops to maybe 3 stops of light between each photograph. But it's absolutely imperative to really pay attention to the scene that you're photographing. And if you ever encounter scenes that look like this when you're doing your exposure bracketing, you might have it set up incorrectly. So definitely want to review your photograph. If you see almost an image that's pure black, or if you see an image that's almost pure white, you probably have too much exposure stops between each photograph. You might want to dial that back a touch. So that is kind of a difficult topic to run through in a quick video, but I do hope that it made sense. Before I do wrap things up here, I do just want to say a big thanks to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a robust and beautiful online platform to develop your website. You can showcase your photography using Squarespace's new Blueprint design system to help guide you through the options to building your online presence from the ground up. You can even display your photography using Squarespace's flexible website design templates and customize the layout in order to make it your own. And with Squarespace's online store feature, you'll have access to all the tools you need to start selling your physical goods, digital content, or service products online with ease. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/MarkDenney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So like I said, if you have any questions about exposure bracketing, or what's the problem that it solves, or what's the problem that you want to avoid, or how do you set it up, or any question related to it, please leave those in the comment section below, and I will do my best to get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, and as always, I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.